It's so sunny out there. Thank you all for coming in. I feel I'm easily made guilty.
How did all this start? You grew up in Texas, right? Suburban Houston?
Yes. Petrochemical hell. Yeah. And that's why I'm here.
Well, what was that like? I mean, I've never spent any time in Houston, in and out of the airport a few times. I didn't like it.
I mean, it is an old saw, but what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And it was a hard place to be a human being. It was a hard place to be alive. I had great parents who noticed the world. They noticed the world and celebrated it. When they saw something beautiful, they handed it to me. They shared it to me. Said, look at this. Isn't this wonderful? And they built in my what otherwise would have been a surly and churlish mind, an enthusiasm and optimism for the brief, beautiful condition of being alive. And so I'm grateful to them for that. I could have gone either way. Yeah, I could have been pretty grumpy and
I bet you have grumpy moments.
The older I get, the happier I get. It was so touching what Zach was talking about sharing. I mean, in that Wild Marsh passage, I feel intensely, as you get deeper into the game, what's that word? That word that's the gene that we don't know if it's there or not. Y'all know it. What is it? It's the thing that that explains when you're nice to somebody and there's no payoff in it for you. Yeah, the altruism gene. We all feel it strongly. I mean, like the Ellen folks feel it. Everybody feels it strongly. The community feels it strongly. People in Montana feel it strongly. They can't find the marker, the chromosome or whatever, but we know it's in us. It's what makes us human. And the older I get, the more I want to share the good stuff I know, or what I think my values, I guess, is what we're talking about.
Is there a lack of that altruism gene, do you think, in humanity? I mean, when we look at some of the messes in the world, is that just a lack of foresight, or is that a lack of that altruism gene?
Speaking as a layperson biologist, I think it's there. I just don't think we have the cultural habitat for its expression or manifestation. But I think it's in us, with every dawn and dusk. I think it's in us. I think we just don't have a good environment in which to express it.
Something we need to listen to more?
Yeah, I guess that's one way of putting it. Yeah, it feels good when you do it, and it feels good.
Yeah, it does. So you grew up in Houston,
Right.
chemical wasteland. Your parents were observant, sharing, generous people. How did you get your outside fix? When I fly over Houston and I look at these miles and miles and miles.
It's Tokyo. Yeah.
I mean, how does a person learn to put a worm on a hook in a place like Houston?
Yeah. That's quite an image. Well, youthful time is cheap. You're going to endure anything when you're young. Growing up in Texas, we were fed this myth of the West, the farthering, wilder country, the better place, all that Alamo crap and independence crap, that Texans, and I can say this because I used to be one, am one, always will be one, I guess, because I was born there, but it comes back to the story of the American West. You were told that the rugged individual could accomplish anything that she or he desired, and you grew up, nursing on that. You believed it, and it became your truth, and you didn't realize that community had a say in these matters and that relationships had a say in these matters. You just thought you were if you were the biggest, strongest, most powerful person in an equation, that you could get done what you wanted to get done. And like vast millions of people came pouring out of Texas with that mindset. What was the question?
We were trying to put a worm on a hook. I mean, I guess to reduce it to basics, I mean, you write so elegantly about the natural world.
Right. I mean,
I
didn't mean that.
Did you hunt? Did you hunt and fish? I mean,
Right.
Kids like me who grew up in Montana,
yeah.
we could walk 4 blocks and go fishing.
Yeah, so, E.O. Wilson talks about biophilia, and oh, I've got this beautiful quote I want to share with y'all that ironically or surprisingly, I came across it this morning. Don't let me forget the question again, please. I'm going to digress here.
Welcome to the life of a journalist.
This guy in Poland, Vaclav Silek, wrote, "A place within a landscape corresponds to a place within the heart." And I so believe that. When you're a kid, you don't need big Montana wilderness to establish a relationship with nature. Anybody who's got kids knows that. I mean, they're going to dig the earthworm in the yard. They're going to be splashing around in the darn street in their rubber boots, and that rain is going to be their nature, or that lightning is going to be their nature. They don't need the Apsarokas. They don't need the yak. They just need the elements: rain, fire, soil, air, whatever. I did forget the question. So how I came by it how I came by it in Texas was just, I mean, if you can find nature in Texas, it doesn't have to be wilderness. It just has to be nature. Yeah. Whether it's a fox squirrel, a gray squirrel dropping nuts on the driveway and you're cutting your heel, walking across barefoot, it's about being alive to the world. It's not about nature. It's about celebrating the condition of life. And again, my parents wired my brain to be that way. And then as I grew, I began to have more appetite and wanted further and farther and more sensate relationships with the world, which only wilder country could keep up with those escalating appetites.
Well, I remember one of your stories that illustrates that very well. It was about 2 young men. One of them had come into some money and was growing a giant bass in his swimming pool. And he'd submerged a Volkswagen, I believe, in the pool to create cover for the pool, or for the bass. And one of his greatest challenges was to keep the local kids from fishing that swimming pool. So I think you're right that there is something in us that wants to get out and connect with nature, whether it's a consumptive way or not.
Right.
But that's a very good point. I think that's a good time for us to read a passage from the story called Goats.
Yeah, no, I'm so happy to be here. And what's that thing in the church, in Catholicism, exorcism? I think it feels good to me to begin being in Bozeman and Yellowstone country by exercising Houston. Yeah, no, This is what it was like. This is a short story from a short story called Goats. This is what it was like to be young and in Houston. After we got our driver's licenses, we used Ben's old station wagon. He was no longer able to drive. And after getting him to bed and hasping the doors shut as if stabling a wild horse and latching the windows from the outside, we left the darkened farmhouse and headed for the lights of the city, which cast a golden half-dome high into the fog and scudding clouds. It was a vast, glowing ball of light, seeming close enough that we could have walked or ridden our bikes to reach it. And driving Ben's big station wagon with its power steering and gas-sucking engine was like piloting a rocket ship. There were no shades of gray out in the country like that. There was only the quiet stillness of night, with crickets chirping, and fireflies, too, back then, and the instrument panels on the dashboard were the only light of fixed reference as we powered through that darkness, hungry for that nearing dome of city light. The gauges and dials before us were nearly as mysterious to us as the instrument panel of a jet airplane, and neither Moxley nor I paid much attention to them. For the most part, he knew only the basics, how to aim the car, steering it crudely like the iron gunboat it was, and how to use the accelerator and the brakes. And after but a few miles of such darkness, there would suddenly be light, blazes of it hurled at us from all directions, grids and window squares and spears of light, sundials and radials of inflorescence and neon. And we were swallowed by it, were born into it, and suddenly we could see before us the hood of the old Detroit iron horse that had carried us into the city and swallowed us as the city and Westheimer Avenue seemed to be swallowing the car, and we were no longer driving so much as being driven. All-night gas stations, all-night grocery stores, movie theaters, restaurants, massage parlors, oil change garages, floral shops, apartment complexes, dentist offices, car dealerships. It was all jammed shoulder to shoulder. There was no zoning, and though we had seen it all before in the daylight, we were accustomed to it, it looked entirely different at night. Alluring, even beautiful, rather than squalid and chaotic. The neon strip fascinated us as might a carnival, but what ultimately caught our imagination on these night sojourns was not the glamorous, exotic urban core, but the strange seams of disintegrating roughness on the perimeters, pockets toward and around which the expanding city spilled and flowed like lava. Little passed-by islands of the past, not unlike our own on the western edge. We passed through the blaze of light in strip malls, the loneliness of illuminated commerce, and came out the other side, on the poorer eastern edge, where all the high-voltage power grids were clustered and the multinational refineries. Here, the air was dense with the odor of burning plastic, vaporous benzenes and toluenes adhering to the palate with every breath, and the night fog sky glowed with blue, pink, and orange flickers from the flares of waste gas jetting from 1,000 smokestacks. You were asking why I left. The blaze of commerce faded over our shoulders and behind us, and often we found ourselves driving through neighborhoods that seemed to be sinking into the black soil, the muck of peat, as if pressed down by the immense weight of the industrial demands placed upon that spongy soil. Gigantic tanks and water towers and chemical vats, strange intestinal folds and coils of tarnished aluminum towering above us, creeping through the remnant forest like nighttime serpents. Snowy egrets and night herons passed through the flames, or so it seemed, and floated amid the puffs of pollution as serenely as if in a dream of grace. And on those back roads, totally lost, splashing through puddles axle deep and deeper, and thudding over potholes big enough to hold a bowling ball, Moxley would sometimes turn the lights off and navigate the darkened streets in that manner, passing through pools of rainbow-colored poisonous light and wisps and tatters of toxic fog, as if gliding with the same grace and purpose as the egrets above us. Many of the rotting old homes had ancient live oaks out in front, their yards bare due to the trees' complete shading of the soil. In the rainy season, the water stood a foot deep in the streets, so that driving up and down them was more like pulling the canals of Venice than driving. And the heat from our car's undercarriage hissed steam as we plowed slowly up and down. We were drawn to these rougher, ranker places at night, and yet we wanted to see them in the full light of day also. And when we would travel to these eastern edges during school while taking a long lunch break or cutting classes, we discovered little hanging-on businesses run out of those disintegrating houses, places where old men and women still made tortillas by hand, or repaired leather boots and work shoes, or did drywall masonry, or made horseshoes by hand, even though there were increasingly few horses and ever more cars and trucks, especially trucks, as urban Texas began the calcification of its myths in full earnestness.
Okay, so we know why you left.
At the age of 18.
Yeah. And then you went in the oil business.
Well, pretty much. I went to school in Utah, yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to be in the woods. I knew I wanted to be in the woods, and I wanted to be in mountains, and I studied wildlife science. And see if I can be really quick with this because it's boring. I got a job with a timber company, Warehouser in Arkansas, as a wildlife biologist intern. My boss was unhappy. He said, you know, you're going to spend all your time at the desk. Right now is the best time of your life. You get to go out and count turkey pellets. You get to go out and count deer pellets. You get to throw the hoop ring, do vegetative transects, whatever. But as soon as you get to be my age, you're going to be miserable because you're going to be where I am. Change your life now. And so I did. And I mean, luckiest break I ever got. And so I changed and studied geology so I could still be outside and work for myself. And then I got a job in Mississippi, spent 7 or 8 years there hunting for oil and gas, and then missed the West that I'd known in Utah and got in the truck and drove back this way.
But you were writing when you were living in Mississippi, right?
Yes, yeah, I was not writing in college. But while I was in Mississippi, I was reading is what I was doing. There's this great, funky, independent bookstore. I didn't think, in addition to, Nick, Zach, Phil, the Ellen, Scott, I did not thank Country Bookshelf, but maybe that'll come up in Q&A. The independent bookstores who, when I was first starting out writing, they would read my crap and sell it or try to. There was a store like that, much like that in Mississippi called Lemuria, just a hippie hangout. I mean, I'd walk in, in my suit. I was a geologist in an office building. But on my lunch break, I'd go, because I was a reader, I'd go to the bookstore and buy books. I mean, that's what we did back then. We bought physical, hard copy books. And every time you had $20, you go buy a book. And they would sell me books and say, read this, read this, read this. This was how alt they were. You go through a beaded curtain. I mean, this was the 1980s. And they had like a beaded curtain, and you walk through it, and there's incense burning in their bookstore. And Lemuria, the buried, whatever of Atlantis, whatever, lost world, that's who they were. They were beautiful folks and still are. And here I am, this conservative oil and gas geologist in the deep south, and these hippies are handing me these books saying, check this shit out, man, check this shit out. And
Did they give you anything good?
Yeah.
Like what?
Jim Harrison, Eudora Welty, Raymond Carver, Joy Williams, Richard Ford, Tobias Wolff, Chekhov, Turgenev. Yes, they gave me good stuff.
Those hippies had it going on.
They changed my life. Everybody's changed my life. I've been really lucky. So what was the question?
That was it. You got it.
Okay.
You didn't duck that one. So you were in Mississippi, and then you came west.
I missed the West deeply, intensely, and South was great, but a little of it went a long way. I mean, it's beautiful. It was beautiful, but once you figure it out, that's the power and weakness of the strength. Is it the power and weakness of the South? Its strength is its weakness. Its predictability and sameness is alluring and comforting and wonderful and excruciating and terrifying and claustrophobic. So I got out.
And then you came west.
Just got in the truck and drove, looking
Which
for...
is, the West is very big. And a lot of
it's hard to miss. I found it.
And most of it is very beautiful. And somehow you wound up in the Yak. I mean, had you heard about it? Were you aiming for the Yak?
No, another piece of luck, just instinct, just, intuition, just thinking. Like this kid in Texas, they're talking about the Alamo and the West and all this stuff and thinking, a little farther west is better, right? There's always more space. Things are better a little farther west, right if you get work, gone to Tennessee, gone to Texas, whatever. Just that mythos built, ingrained in me as a child. I was already wired to want to go west. And then having had that Utah gig in Logan, I really fell in love with mountains and then got away from them when I was back down in Mississippi. And I knew, okay, Mississippi, the West, I choose door number 2. So I'm heading back, but just looking I thought any place in the West would have what I wanted and needed. But in those short 8 years, the West had changed. As we, everybody in Montana and the West knows things are changing quickly and they're not stopping. So I'm driving around looking for the West that I remember, and already in that short time, it's changed. I couldn't find that quality of isolation and privacy and space that I remembered. And so I just kept pushing north and west, like a salmon going upriver. Just, I know it's there, I know it's there. And then I got to Whitefish. I had a little inside baseball on Whitefish. I'd been there before and knew that it was a funky little ski town, and which, believe it or not, it used to be. So I kind of thought, well, the worst comes to worst, I'll just rent an apartment there and ski and then do recon later in the next year. And went into a realtor's office and said, I'm looking for something remote where I can live for free. And
You have a realtor's office?
yeah. No, I was young. I was really naive, and it was lunchtime, and he had, it was slow doings back then, and he crazily, he tolerated me and said, well, if you want remote, you should go to the Yak. And it was just 2 valleys over. And he said, we actually have a property listing there, and you should go look at it. And I pretended like I would be able to purchase it. And it was an old hunting lodge, and it was and it had a caretaker there. And so my girlfriend and I drove up over the Dodge Summit to go ostensibly look at this place. We've got our black and tan hounds chained in the back of the truck. We've got all of our luggage. This was before Gore-Tex, so everything's wrapped in black trash bags, and it just looks like we're this big truck going off to the dump. And we'd pull up in front of this beautiful, hunting lodge that the outfitter, blah, 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 was not able to live there anymore, so he's got caretaker. Knock on the door, pretending that we're going to be buyers, which we couldn't buy lunch. And this very, I hope she's not in the audience tonight, this very frazzled, harried, well, never mind. I don't have to say the vulgarity. She said I could just say fill in the blank, and you can imagine the most vulgar phrase ever. I don't have to say it. Right. So knock on the door and say, we're here to look at the property. Ross, the realtor, sent us. And she just jams the door open, and her hair's all wild, and she looks like she's just stamped out the hem of her dress on fire, and her chickens are flapping around dead in the yard. It's August, and they're hot, and it's just like a vision of hell, and her eyes are just going off every direction. And she goes, well, we're here to look at the house. She goes, I can't take it anymore. I've had enough. I've had enough with this blank, blank, blank. 2 words, 2 nouns, blank, blank. I've had enough with this blank, blank. And go look at it. Go look at it. I don't care. I hope it burns to hell. I'm leaving. And she's just she doesn't grab us by the collars, but it was that degree of desperation. She goes, if you don't want to buy it, will you please be caretakers and bail me out? And so, yeah, okay, we'll do that. So, yeah.
And you've written many times that you came over the divide and looked at it and said,
yeah,
this is home, this is love, this is where
love
we're
at
going to
first
stay.
sight.
It grabbed you by the collars.
Totally, back to that Sillett quote, the shape of the hills, the velvet folds of the unglaciated Yak, very Appalachian, very soft. You got some deciduous pockets, but incredibly diverse. Just the shape of the hills, the colors just fit the shape of your mind and the shape of your heart, and you just knew, I'm gonna bet my life on this.
And that was in 1987.
Right.
And you built a home there, raised your children.
Yep.
And
Good God, yeah.
and became
Boy,
an
do they have
activist
stories.
for the protection of the Yak.
Yep.
How do you do that? How do you switch hats from artist, author to activist? Or do you even have to?
You have
Is
to.
that a
You have
switching
to.
of the
You
hats?
have to. Nobody. I mean, we're all activists, right? We live in Montana. A great joke about Mississippi. I mean, there's all these great writers from Mississippi, right? And the joke is there are more writers in Mississippi than there are readers. And obviously that doesn't apply to Montana, but there are more activists in Montana than there are people. It's so. Yeah, you have to keep it separate. I mean, you go crazy if you if you let your activism life get into your fun life. Your hiking or riding or reading life. You've got to firewall it, and that's hard to do.
How do you do that?
You just tell yourself every morning when you get up, remember not to let the two mix up, and finally it becomes habit.
Do you set aside a certain part of the day for, if you're involved in a campaign?
Yeah.
Do you set aside, okay, I'm going to work
Totally.
on these issues this morning, and I'll write this afternoon, or the opposite?
Yeah. And this is what we'll talk about in the workshops in class. I feel sorry for those students. I'm going to try and be open and tolerant, but that's not my nature. So one of the things I'm going to tell them is the worst thing you can do as a writer is to know what the end of your story is going to be. That's what we do as activists. We know that we want the Yak roadless areas protected as wilderness. We know that we want this dam removed. We know that we don't want this mine dug, whatever. We already know the end of the story in activism, and that's deadly toxic to the reader-writer rapport, the relationship. Knowing in an ideal story, an ideal essay, you go on a journey, you, the writer, go on a journey with your partner, your peer, the reader, and y'all make these discoveries at pretty much the same time. And so there's an organic spontaneity and delight in being in the world that you and the reader share. And that's what gives, in my narrow view, or my personal view, writing greatness. It's what I love to read, it's what I love to write, and it's the journey I love to go on. So in activism, you are not allowed that indulgence. You already know what the end of the story is going to be. So it's important to me to keep a firewall between the two.
Do you know the end of the story with activism? I mean,
Yeah, I know what I want, yeah.
You know what you want the end of the story to be.
Right.
But do you know the end of the story? I mean, you
Yes,
wrote...
I'm going to win.
Good. You wrote, I think it was in the book of the Yak, it's possible art could protect the last roadless areas of the Yak Valley, that art could protect them, but I just don't think there's time for it.
Yeah.
Is that what you were thinking? I mean, in terms of dividing your life between activism and art?
Yeah, I believe that strongly when I wrote it. I don't believe it now, which is wonderful. I love changing across time. You know, I came of age in the Yak in the 80s during the timber wars, the corporate raiders, the liquidations, you know, where if you had capital, people come after it and liquidate it, and whether it was timber or whatever, and break it down, sell it. There was not time in the 80s. It was hand-to-hand, you know, death throes, combat. There was not time to write a great novel like, you know, Sometimes a Great Notion or Crossing to Safety or Angle of Repose. There was not time to spend 10, 15 years writing a novel and then put it out and have it be handed from generation to generation about the values of permanence or the values of living on the land or the values of moderation or the values of... There was not time in the 80s. There was not time. Now in the Yak, ironically or paradoxically or wonderfully, there is time. So now is the time, I think, for great efforts in art, in music, in literature, in whatever art form, in humanities. We have, through dint of struggle and combat and battle, we have carved out a space that we can defend in the Yak and other places in Montana. And there is a huge opportunity, a huge, again, fluorescence or fertility, a garden for art right now, right here. And I'm really excited to be in this community, in this state, during that movement, which has returned. It was here in the past, you know, Hugo and all the others. Then it went away during the wars, the resource wars. Right now, we've got an opportunity where we can write some pretty things, we can make some pretty things, and change, influence, shape the hearts of those who come after us. We're so lucky. We're so lucky to be here right now.
Does that result from the activism of the 80s?
Yeah, totally. No, it was hard bought. It was,
Yeah.
I mean, no, exactly. It's a good point.
That's
Good
what-
cop, bad cop. Yeah, totally.
That's what gave activists and conservationists a little breathing room.
Yeah, I mean,
We have now.
we're definitely in a bad spot. I'm not saying that the world is a merry place right now, but in Montana, the values of conservation and preservation are shared across enough stakeholders. There is enough of a community of preservation right now that we have not just the opportunity, but the need to make some pretty things. I mean, people's hearts are burned out from the wars. The activists, the battlers, the warriors are tired and injured and damaged, and they need pretty things. And that's what artists do, is make pretty things and give them to people who need them. And it's a perfect confluence right now of need and opportunity.
Speaking of
It won't last.
Speaking of pretty things, could you read from The Wild Marsh?
Yeah.
For page 135. This is a remarkable book about living in the Yak Valley, and it's a beautiful passage, and I'd like to have you read it.
Yeah, thanks. My executive director of this conservation group, I'm a board member of it, is another Bozeman resident, Dave Henderson. We're tasked with raising funds for this little grassroots group, and I would be remiss if not using this opportunity to encourage you to go to www.yakvalley.org, see how you can help.
Yak with 2 A's.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm such a bad fundraiser. That was like, I wouldn't have remembered that. This Wild Marsh book is back to that sharing thing that Zach so beautifully articulated in his introduction. I want to talk about hunting a little bit tonight, but and the idea of hunting and gathering and sharing. But again, just when you get kids, you want to hand something valuable to them. You want them to carry it forward. So that's what this book is about. I wrote it in the year 2000, thinking, okay, 100 years from now, somebody's going to fall in love with this valley the way I'm in love with it. And they're going to want to know, I wonder what it was like 100 years ago. So I wrote this book kind of on the nose on 2000 about what the Yak is like. It's just a little half-page entry from the month of May. It's a journal of the 12 months up there in the Yak. I've said it before, this isn't a place to come to. It's a place to dream of. It's a biological wilderness, full of frog roar and swamp muck and tangled blowdown and mosquitoes and deeply angry, suspicious people, none of whom would be surprised to see your happy vacationing face. Yeah. It's true. Just send us money, don't come. Some days I hate myself. This is a place of mud and muck, a celebration of the rank and the fecund, the cold and the uncomfortable, the frayed and the wild. This is a place whose last wild garden should be protected for its own sake, not yours or mine. They are gardens. While much or most of the world in May is puttering about in the warming black earth, coaxing carrot seeds and lettuce sprouts into the bright new world, the gardens I am most interested in have not been planted by the hand of man or woman, but are instead bulging, swelling, shifting, on the verge of delivering kicking spotted elk calves back into the world, and are delivering bears back into the world, tumbling once more to the surface from their earthen burrows like astronauts returning from the strangest of journeys. Mountains delivering torrents of rushing water, recharging the buried aquifers between immense slabs of tilted stone. The fossils of ancient sea creatures tumbling with the season's new talus down into the bed of bright glacier lilies below. Trilobites, fenestrellids, cephalopods, and ostracods on the prowl once more, and the earth itself stretching and yawning like a wildcat, supple and hungry, awakened, youthful, vibrant. A garden of dragonflies rising from the waving marsh fronds like sunlit jewels summoned by no gardener we will ever meet in this life, and one whose careful and calculated, fitted and meaningful work, closely studied, can bring, I am convinced, immeasurable blessings of peacefulness to the student of that work, the careful student who observes and ponders the goals of that precise gardener.
So all these years you've been living in the Yak Valley, one thing that I've become increasingly interested in recent years is the preservation of wild land versus wilderness with a capital W. And you lived in a very wild place and learned to make your home there. But it wasn't wilderness with a capital W, even though you advocated for that nearby and very, very forcefully. But what is the difference between wild land and wilderness?
God, dog is God. You didn't tell me you were going to do this.
Well,
I thought it was going to be softball.
We'll get to the low-hanging fruit later.
Well, we know what wilderness is through our through listening to our dear friend Doug Peacock. I mean, who is the arbiter of all things wild and wilderness. Wilderness is a place where animals live who can kill and eat you. That's it. That's all. That's the bottom line definition. Wildness. You know, I think when I think of wildness, I think of places where the surprising can happen. Where you realize you're more likely to realize you're not in control of the outcome. You don't control a situation as much as inhabit it, and you follow its moods and rhythms and logic, and you pay attention to its movements, and that is, you know, wild, and it's invigorating. It's the sense. It requires a quality of the sensate, you know, of hearing, thinking, smelling, listening, tasting, touching. You know, it requires the senses to be engaged, and so you can have wildness, as we all know. You know, out on Wilson, out on Main Street, you can have wildness anywhere. It's not wilderness. But there is also a huge Venn diagram overlap, you know, of wildness and wilderness. But I'll go back to Doug. You know, if you want to find wilderness, you need to have an animal that can kill and eat you. Otherwise, it's not wilderness. It can be sweet nature, it can be sweet country, it can be beautiful, it can be pastoral, it can be rugged, it can be wild, but it's not wilderness. You know, we're talking about grizzly bears is what we're talking about. You know, lions, of course, but really grizzlies.
Well, go ahead. Along that line, when you were first living in the Yak and learning to live in wildness and the skills that it took to make a living there in that ramshackle old hunting lodge, which I just learned belonged to a mutual friend of ours that I've lost track of over the years. But anyway, could you read from Winter, your book about living in the Yak?
Yeah.
A couple of brief passages there, and it's about labor and the fruits of labor in a wild place where there's not a lot of help and you have to count on yourself. Could you please do that?
Yeah, no, and thanks for pulling those sections out.
Page 61. I'm
Thank
here
you.
to help.
You're making up for your faux pas previously. Thank you. This is it's not too long a section. It's 2 pages, right? Yeah, okay. No, so I moved up there from Mississippi and didn't know anything about really snow or anything. This is a journal from October 5th. People said you got to have firewood if you're going to live up here all winter, and that was the cultural currency, the point of discussion. Like, you could talk about firewood.
You get your elk yet?
Same deal, right? Yeah, same deal. October 5th. My chainsaw is a Stihl 034. It's orange and white, made in Germany, and it's not a professional saw, but almost. It's big and strong, a wild horse, and I'm scared to death of it. I've read and reread the 60-page instruction book several times. My Stihl starts like a fine car, fuel injected, and rumbles nicely with a throbbing, rattling purr when it's set on slow idle. It's complex and has all sorts of tricks and gimmicks, such as carburetor preheating, which is required at 0 degrees and below. Most people cut wood in the winter so that it warms twice. You work up a sweat sawing and then get warm again burning it. The manual uses phrases like blipping the throttle, and is chock full of sentences like, a roll-o-matic guide bar is not necessary to separately lubricate the sprocket nose because the chain oil which flows to the bearing by way of the bar groove during normal operation is adequate for lubrication. And this is necessary because high contraction stresses would otherwise occur as the chain cools down to ambient temperature, especially at extremely low outside temperatures, and cause damage to the crankshaft and bearings. I'm a slow reader, even with things I understand. I trace the words over and over again with my finger, saying some of the sentences out loud. Elizabeth believes that this concentration on and fascination with the owner's manual is boy stuff, a guy thing, that I'm enjoying the schematics and such, the hard-edged rules and facts. But it's not that at all. I'd rather be walking through the woods or sitting by the river reading poetry, but this is something I've got to learn. This is something that is going to keep us warm. There's something in the manual about white finger. I've heard people in the saloon talking about this condition, have seen guys who have it chronically. It's amazing they're still able to work. Their fingers are swollen and white, scaly and flaky, and they can hardly move them. They stare at their hands while sitting in the bar, holding a drink or reaching for a mug, as if the hands do not belong to them. From the manual. Prolonged use of chainsaws or other machines exposing the operator to vibrations may produce white finger disease, Raynaud's phenomenon. This phenomenon reduces the hand's ability to feel and regulate temperature, produces numbness and burning sensations, and may cause nerve and circulation damage and tissue necrosis. The way to avoid white finger is not mentioned. I suppose I should rest and exercise my fingers every so often, get some blood flowing into them. I should cut a cord or so and then set the saw down to rest it and myself. I need my fingers to write with. And go for a walk up into the woods. If there were not a disease like white finger, a danger of it, I would have to create one. I've got a hard hat, goggles and earplugs, steel-toed red-wing boots and leather gloves. I'm scared to death of this big saw, and yet I'm excited about using it. A little bit about how I feel about teaching here.
Okay, if you'd turn to page 123 and explain to us why you risked white finger.
Huh. Oh, yeah, sweet, right. Oh, that's a sweet little passage. Cool. Okay. It's from December. It's December 19th journal entry. A cold front came down out of Alaska yesterday, dropping the temperature from 20 above to 15 below in less than an hour. Branches and limbs blowing from the trees, everything tumbling past, and the wind biting, ripping. The temperature kept dropping after dark, crackling cold stars, plunging, bottoming out around 38, 39 below, and then the wind disappeared. It's staying that cold, the air motionless. You guys don't know anything about that. The way they said it would be, 40 below at night and warming up to 10 or 12 below during the day. We leave to visit relatives in a few days, relatives in warmer country, and we'll turn off the water, drain the pipes, lock up. But for now, we sleep in front of the fireplace, wood burning around the clock, turning the pages of books clumsily with our gloved hands. 40 below. We're a little frightened. We're at the mercy of the cold. We hope for mercy. It's as if the brutal cold is looking for something, passing over, searching. I hope it doesn't find what it's looking for here. I want it to move on. We hide in our sleeping bags. The fire crackles, but it doesn't seem to put out any heat. We can't get close enough to it. This cold cannot last 3 days, 4 days, a week at the most, and we must remember that. Blankets over the trucks and car in the garages. The generator won't turn over. Can't get the valves to open, too cold. We read, we sleep. We can't get warm. But this won't last.
Things aren't always that hard.
Right. Like today, it's pretty sweet.
Yeah, today's, God, what a day today after all this rain. You said earlier you wanted to talk about hunting. And,
Yeah.
We're both avid hunters. We'd like to get out and, is that you or me? We both like to get out and make things pop. And you've written particularly elegantly about your bird hunting and your life with your dogs, and what it's like to get out there and chase these magnificent animals around. What you haven't written about that I know about is coming home with a bag limit, which doesn't seem to make much difference to you. because I think you're out there for the dogs and what the dogs are showing you. Am I close to it?
You're pretty close. Yeah. No, I had lunch with Tim Crawford today, and we were talking about Tim and Kathy loving dogs and horses, and it's not about killing things. It's about chasing things.
Yeah.
And not shooting straight. Anybody can learn to shoot straight except me. Shooting straight is robotic. It's boring. It's more exciting when you miss.
Those are the more memorable ones I've found. I remember the misses more than the hits.
Right. No, it's true.
It's kind of like getting lucky in poker. You might not remember the times that you got lucky, but you always remember the times somebody else got lucky. And I have a similar approach to bird hunting. But I really enjoyed your book about Coulter, your dog Coulter. Could you read a passage from that? There's one on 153.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. Oh, he's a sweet hound, a German short-haired pointer, or what my friends Tom and Nancy, who sold me Coulter, called German short-head pointers. They're just beautiful athletes, but they're just not real smart.
Smart enough to lead you around.
Like I said, yeah. But they can run. I don't know what you need to know before this passage about what's going on. I've got a dog, Coulter, this great dog who fell into my hands. Definitely too good for me. It was like the first year I became a bird hunter, so I've got the world's best dog and the world's worst bird hunter. That's like a train wreck, right? And then I got one of his brothers, 3 years younger than him, named Superman, who was not, and Coulter was. So I think that's all you need to know, and I'm over on this side of the divide. It was too hot to run the bomb machine more than 15 or 20 minutes. I stopped and watered him. He was lapping water from my cupped hand, panting, yet impatient to get back to the birds. And I poured water over his broad, brown skull and trickled it all down his backbone. The water pooled for a moment between the twin points of his bony haunches, then parted and slid off on either side. He shook enthusiastically, all floppy-limbed in that awkward hound dog way, then set off again, ceaselessly hunting, but I headed him back to the truck where Superman was snoozing. Because Coulter was drenched and I did not want him nastying up the passenger seat, I made the mistake of putting him in the kennel with Superman. As we drove off over the bouncy road, searching for a new place to hunt, I heard a snarling and tussling, a thumping, a yelp. And when I stopped, I saw that Superman had a slash just beneath his eye, from which welled a crescent of blood, bright red in the sunlight. I soothed Superman, but didn't scold Coulter. It was my fault, squeezing him in with a youngster like that. We hunted again into the sun, but still couldn't find any upland birds. I was able to shoot another dove and began to consider how it would taste fried with cream gravy. Back at the truck, I emptied the melt water from the ice chest over Coulter's head and back. Then I took Superman out into the prairie for a spin, more to exercise him and expose him to the vastness of space and sky and ground underfoot than with the hope of finding any birds. Perhaps traveling this landscape will unlock some ancient hidden message, and he will blossom miraculously into even 1/10 the genius that his brother is. We pressed on into the heat with blue sky all around us. Afterward, I hosed him off too, and, bleary-eyed from the all-night drive, we headed to the little town to look for a motel where we could check in and nap in the heat of the day. On the banks of one of the wide rivers that flows into the Missouri, we found a tourist court kind of place with 12 little cottages, stark white beneath the still green murmurings of riverside cottonwoods, set in green lawn with sprinklers whizzing. Wild roses grew around all the cottages, and white picnic tables were set out on the lawn beneath the giant cottonwoods, and the whole place was vacant. We would be the only guests. The lady at the counter said that the room would be $25, but that there was an additional charge of $5 per dog. "Ah," I said, reaching for a billfold, "you're killing me." There was a fan in the room. The windows were open. Superman pranced back and forth, up and down, from the floor to the bed and back like a kid on a trampoline, executing fancy twists and flips over the back of the infinitely more mature Coulter. I collapsed onto the creaky old bed, which was so soft and ancient, so spineless as to be more like a hammock. Coulter hopped up and lay down next to me with his head stretched out on the pillow, and Superman wriggled in and draped himself across both of us. This was clearly his favorite part of the hunt. Coulter sat up and leaned over and licked the wound on his brother's face, tending to it with great concern, as if having no earthly idea of how it got there in the first place. He looked over at me then, and I studied him back, trying to see across that gulf between us, the one that does not let me understand the gulf within him, his placidness now versus his maniacal otherworldliness when he's pushing a pheasant, run and gun, tearing up the brush, or working his way like a missile back toward the ripe scent of sharp tails. I cannot fully grasp how he can have two such different lives. One he spends waiting, and then the second, higher, supercharged life into which he ignites every autumn. He laid his head back down on the pillow with a groan and began to snore. He had made it through the boredom of summer, and now he had a partner who was going to take him hunting as much as he absolutely could. "This is the best time of year, boys," I said to them just before I sank into unconsciousness.
Sharp tail with cream gravy, huh? That sounds pretty good.
Yeah, it does.
One of the projects you've been doing in the last couple of years is traveling around the country, preparing meals for writers you admire. Which, man, that sounds like fun. But I'm curious, how does the menu differ for, say, Joyce Carol Oates and Doug Peacock?
Significantly.
Are they both paleo?
Significantly.
I mean, how do you pick them? How do you arrange these evenings? What do you cook?
You know, I'm not much of a planner or a plotter, but you're dead on that. There's this goofy project where I got in my mind as I became older and saw my hero slipping off the face of the earth. Okay, back up. Thing that really gripes me is like something we as writers do. When one of us kicks off, we write a nice obituary about what her or his work meant to us. Ivan Doig most recently, you name them, they're just going. There was this great generation of magnificent writers, and they helped me, either they helped me actively or helped me just by being great writers. They helped me as a reader. And so I got in my mind, I don't want to be writing essays about what their work meant to me after they're gone. I want them to know what they mean to me while they're here. And I don't go, so I came up with this idea of going around to their houses and cooking these really nice meals for them. I started getting into cooking and really loving it, loving food, loving cooking, loving eating. And it's so easy in your house, right? Like you can put out a good meal and think, damn, that was good. What I had not understood was when you go 2,000 miles away and you're in somebody's strange kitchen and you're going to be cooking in a strange environment while having these deep conversations about literature, it's challenging. So I had not, I'm in over my head is where I am. Yeah, but yeah, I pick, like I obviously take a lot of wild game with me because that's the best food there is, right? And I want to share the best with them. But you do have different writers are going to have different taste. I take my best, I do a lot of teaching. I teach out in Maine with a low residency MFA program. I teach, here in state. I do a lot of teaching. I teach at University of Utah's summer place in the Centennial Mountains, a residency place. And I take different younger writers with me to introduce them to these old giants who are going to be leaving us soon. And I want to be like a bridge, like, you need to read this writer. Like, this is awful. Like, I had the great privilege of being a Kittredge chair a couple of times, once in environmental studies and once in English. I mean, I'd still be making a living off Bill Kittredge if he'd studied chemistry or geology or something. But some of the students in his class, or in this endowed classes, had not read his work, and that's just not right. So I have this, again, back to this idea that Zach talked about sharing. As I get older, I really want to share my heroes with the next generation of writers, and why they are heroes, why they're great, and also say thank you to them. So I go all around the country, all around the world. I went to France for John Berger, this totally unknown, magnificent writer of fiction and nonfiction, art critic, just this celebrant of the peasant life, beautiful man. He's 92 years old and he is robust. He still splits his own wood. Just a great model of how to be as a writer, as is Deb Peacock. My youngest daughter, Lowry, is a budding writer, and she joins me on some of these journeys. I take my best fiction writer or my best nonfiction writer, depending on which writer we're visiting, and then I introduce them to these heroes. And we went to see David Sedaris, who is not he's like his peer. He's the same age, right? But I love what he does with humor and how he gets down to the deep stuff right at the end. He is an activist of sorts. He is an activist without being recognized as one. Like, you're not supposed to take meat products into Europe, right? But I've got like this long elk backstrap that I just want to share with him. And this is no disrespect intended to anybody here, but David is just freewheeling, and David's partner, Hugh, is very precise and neat. Well, first you've got to get the meat through customs. And so it's frozen. You can take fish into Europe. Did you know that? You could take salmon, trout, whatever. You just can't take meat. So I just wrote on the outside of this frozen backstrap, tuna. And so we carry this long loin of backstrap into England, labeled tuna, walk into his beautiful cottage out in Sussex, and dripping blood, up the sidewalk, up past the manicured gardens, the English gardens, and into the beautiful cottage and across the beautiful tile floor. And Hugh just looks at the blood dripping off and looks at me and says, "Who is this?" We cooked it. The elk was incredible. It was one of those. This is one of the things about the project. You're used to cooking in your kitchen. You're not used to cooking. They sell butter by the ball over there. It's not like in those little nice 1 tablespoon, 2 tablespoon things. They just give you a ball of butter, and you've got to figure out how much fits the recipe. And I didn't. And with my pine nut tart, which was swimming in a sea of butter, it was revolting. God, it was revolting. But the elk was good. And the highlight of the evening was Lowry sitting in the dining room with her hero, David, by the crackling fire, and they're eating these perfectly grilled, medium rare to rare slices of yak, elk, backstrap, just hands, as fast as I was bringing it in, they just slice it, eat it, slice it, eat it. You know the drill, right? And David's he's just eating it like a wolverine and wiping his hands on his napkin, and he's all excited and telling these incredible stories. And he and Lowry are trading puns about celebrities with tree names, John Travolta, Matthew McConifer. I can't remember them all, but they're just going back and forth. My 19-year-old daughter is hanging with David Sedaris and holding her own with these puns, and just this beautiful experience. And my nonfiction writer and I are in there like working our ass off in the kitchen. Anyway, David gets up to leave the room for a second, and Lowry, who's such a lit wonk, and she runs over to his napkin that's just bloodstained with his elk and grabs it and folds it up and puts it in her purse. That's not your question, but that's one. Got to cook for Tom and Laurie McGuane this summer, and we had a lot of people over. Walter Kern, a bunch of people came over to join the feast, and Tom was just magnificent. He's just so damn funny and so damn smart. But he's out fishing, you know, down in the Boulder River, and well, I'm again, instead of talking lit, I'm working my ass off in the kitchen, and my fiction, a couple of my fiction writers are there, and we're just like
Working in the kitchen doing their deal, but I've got the turkey, and I'm out on the grill, and it's not what I'm familiar with, and the turkey catches on fire. Have you ever seen a turkey on fire? I thought the house was on fire. There's just this blue smoke coming out from where he knew his house used to be. And we're pouring water onto this blackened carcass of a turkey. He and Laurie are crying. Yeah, so it was not my intent. My intention, as they say in yoga, was not that. It was something else.
So it was tuna sandwiches that night at the McGuane place?
We had a plan B. We had chili. Elk chili.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm sure some of the folks here are going to have questions.